Martha Vance was 66 years old when she sat on the cold stone porch of Street Jude's with a single suitcase and $14. But what her ex-husband Julian and her 3 grown children didn't know was that some debts are collected by the universe itself. They thought they had stripped her of every cent she earned during 40 years of building a construction empire, but a miracle was waiting behind a rusted iron gate. If you've ever felt the world underestimated you because of your age, this story is for you. If you've ever been discarded by those who should have valued you more than anything, Martha's journey will speak to your soul. If you've ever thought everything was lost when it was actually just beginning, you must see how this ends. Subscribe now, because what Martha found when that old church door finally creaked open will make you believe that divine justice never ever gets the address wrong. The rain had been falling for 3 hours. It soaked into the hem of her wool coat. Martha watched the water run down the carved stone of the vestibule. She did not feel the cold. She felt the weight of the silver thimble in her pocket. It was a small thing. It was her only inheritance after a 40-year marriage. Her children had stopped calling 3 weeks ago. They had taken Julian's side because Julian held the checkbook. They told her she was being difficult. They said she should find a quiet apartment. But Martha had no intention of being quiet. She had the key to a place they had forgotten existed. The valley below was filled with fog. The lights of the city she used to call home were invisible. Martha stood up and wiped the water from her face. She was 66 years old, and she was starting over. She wasn't using lawyers. She was using the truth. The world thinks a woman of a certain age is invisible. Martha Vance was about to prove that being invisible is a powerful advantage. The silence of the church was heavy. It smelled of old cedar and wet stone. The story of what happened next would be whispered in the valley for decades. It began with a woman who had nothing left to lose. It ended with a legacy that money could never buy. Martha Vance was 66 years old, and she had spent her life as the silent architect of someone else's dream. She had been 19 when she met Julian Vance at a county fair. They had nothing then but a toolbox and an old Ford truck. For the next 40 years, she had been the one to manage the ledgers while sitting at a kitchen table covered in flour and children's drawings. She had been the one to stay up until 3 in the morning to finish the payroll, so the crews wouldn't go without their checks on Friday. When Julian wanted to expand into commercial real estate, Martha had been the one to sell her grandmother's small plot of land to provide the initial capital. She had never asked for her name to be on the company letterhead. She had never requested a salary for the decades of bookkeeping and contract management she performed. She had even been the one to drive the delivery trucks when the company was too small to hire a driver. She had navigated the mountain passes with a baby sleeping in the passenger seat and a map spread across her lap. She had hosted the dinner parties that secured the big contracts. She had spent days preparing the house and the menus to ensure every potential investor felt like family. She had worn the same 2 dresses for years to make sure Julian always had the best tailored suits for his meetings. She believed they were a team. She believed that the sweat she put into the foundations was just as valuable as the signature Julian put on the blueprints. She had been the one to paint the interiors of their first 3 apartment buildings by hand to save on labor costs. She had spent weeks on a ladder with a roller in her hand and a bandana over her hair. She did it all because she thought they were building a legacy for their children. There was a specific memory she kept from the early days. It was 1991, and the winter had been particularly brutal. The business was on the verge of bankruptcy. Julian had sat on the floor of their small living room with his head in his hands. Martha had knelt beside him and told him they would make it. She had shown him the spreadsheet she created that cut their personal expenses to the bone. Julian had looked at her then with tears in his eyes and told her he didn't deserve her. He said that once they were successful, he would spend the rest of his life making sure she was taken care of. He had kissed her hands and promised that everything he owned was hers. She had believed him because she wanted to. She had believed him because she couldn't imagine a world where love was just a business transaction. The ordinary details of her life before the collapse were filled with a quiet dignity. She would spend her mornings in the garden of their 5-acre estate. She would pull weeds and check the roses while the sun was still low. She would stop at 9 o'clock to make Julian's breakfast exactly the way he liked it. She would place the silver thimble on the counter while she worked. It was a habit she learned from her mother, who had been a professional seamstress. Her mother always said that a thimble was a shield for the person who does the hard work. Martha had held on to that thimble through every move and every expansion of the business. It was her grounding point. It was a reminder that she came from people who knew how to build things that lasted. She didn't know that Julian was already meeting with a specialized divorce attorney in the city. She didn't know that the prenuptial agreement she had signed in a haze of young love was being dusted off. She was 66 years old, and she was still making plans for their 40th anniversary trip. She thought the foundation was solid. She was wrong. Julian's office was on the 42nd floor. The glass walls showed the city she had helped him conquer. Martha sat in a chair that cost more than her first car. Julian sat behind a desk of polished ebony. Their 3 children sat on the leather sofa. None of them looked at her. They looked at their phones or the view. Julian cleared his throat. He looked handsome in his charcoal suit. He looked like a man who had never spent a night worrying about payroll. "We're just being realistic, Martha," Julian said. He leaned back and laced his fingers together. "At your age, you can't manage a property this size alone. We're worried about you." Martha looked at her oldest son, David. He was texting someone. He didn't look up. "This is what's best for everyone," Julian continued. He pushed a single manila folder across the vast desk. It moved silently over the wood. Martha didn't touch it. She knew what was inside. It was the prenuptial agreement from 1985. It was 3 pages of legalese that turned 40 years of labor into a zero. The cruelty was in the silence of her children. Sarah was looking at a fashion magazine on her tablet. She didn't even blink when Julian mentioned the house. "Dad would have wanted this," Julian said. He was referring to his own father who had died decades ago. It was a lie. His father had loved Martha like a daughter. "You should have planned better for your own future," Julian added. His voice was smooth. It was the voice he used with city inspectors. "We're not being cruel. We've talked it over. We're being practical. It's a clean break." Then Julian leaned forward. His eyes were cold. 40 years is a long time to string someone along, even if she was essentially just the help, he said. The room went very still. Sarah finally looked up from her tablet. She didn't look shocked. She looked bored. Martha felt the silver thimble in her pocket. The metal was cold against her thumb. She realized then that they had discussed this. They had sat in this office and decided she was a line item to be deleted. The construction empire to Julian, the 5-acre estate to Julian, the investment accounts to Julian. While they exchanged victorious glances and checked their watches, Martha received what they called the rest, a deed to a deconsecrated church and a ruin of a cottage in a village 3 hours away. "You're not getting nothing," Julian said. He checked his gold watch. "You're getting a property. It's what you always said you wanted. Peace and quiet." He smiled. It was a professional smile. It didn't reach his eyes. He stood up. The meeting was over. He had a lunch appointment with a woman 20 years younger than Martha. The children stood up too. They moved toward the door without a word to her. David stopped at the door. He didn't turn around. "We'll send your clothes to the church, Mum," he said. He was already opening a new message on his phone. They left the room. The click of the door was the only sound in the office. Martha sat in the expensive chair. She looked at the city through the glass. She looked at the buildings she had budgeted. She looked at the skyline she had helped fund with her grandmother's land. She stood up slowly. Her knees ached. It was a dull throb she had ignored for years. She walked to the desk and picked up the folder. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. She simply walked out of the office. She walked past the receptionist who had worked for her for 10 years. The woman looked away. Martha walked to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby. "I built those walls," she whispered to the empty elevator. She felt the thimble in her pocket. She didn't look back. Martha stood on the sidewalk outside the glass tower for 10 minutes. The wind pulled at her scarf. People in expensive suits brushed past her without looking. She walked 3 blocks to the parking garage where her old work truck was parked. It was a 15-year-old Ford with rusted wheel wells and a cracked windshield. Julian had let her keep it because the company logo had been scraped off the door with a razor blade. He said it didn't fit the new corporate image. She climbed into the driver's seat. The springs groaned under her weight. In the passenger seat sat Buster. He was a 14-year-old golden retriever with a face as white as a cloud. His hips were bad and he moved slowly. Sarah had said he smelled like old blankets and wouldn't fit in her new apartment. Julian had suggested a vet in the city who handled end-of-life transitions. Martha had put Buster in the truck before the movers arrived. He rested his heavy head on her thigh now. Martha opened her leather wallet. She pulled out the contents. There were 3 $5 bills, 4 ones, and 2 quarters. She searched the bottom of her purse and found 3 dimes, 1 nickel, and 7 pennies. She had exactly $22.42 left in the world. She reached into the small zippered pocket of her purse and felt the silver thimble. She pulled it out and held it up to the light. The sapphire on the rim caught a stray beam of sun. She looked at her phone. The screen was bright and clean. There were no missed calls. There were no text messages from David or Sarah. Even her youngest, who usually sent a morning emoji, was silent. The only notification was an automated alert from her bank. It informed her that her joint access had been terminated. The balance on her personal card was 0. The silence of the phone felt heavier than the truck. She looked at the manila folder on the dashboard. The address for Street Judes of the Hollow was written in Julian's assistant's neat handwriting. It was a place she hadn't seen in 30 years. It was a village tucked into a fold of the mountains, where the cell service was famously spotty. She knew why Julian had given it to her. He wanted her to disappear. He wanted her to be a ghost in a ghost town. "We're going home, Buster," she said. Her voice sounded thin in the cab. Buster thumped his tail once against the seat. It was a hollow, rhythmic sound. Martha turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed twice and then roared into a rough idle. She didn't have enough gas to make it the whole way. She would have to stop twice and spend the money she had. She wouldn't have enough for a meal. She put the truck in gear. She didn't look at the glass tower in the rearview mirror. She watched the road ahead. The city began to thin out into warehouses and then into open fields. The sky turned a bruised purple as the sun went down. Martha felt the thimble in her hand. She squeezed it until the metal bit into her palm. It was a small pain. It was a real pain. She stopped at a gas station 60 miles outside the city. She put $15 into the tank. She bought a single bag of dried beef for Buster and a bottle of water for herself. She had $7.42 left. She sat in the cab and watched the dog eat. His teeth were dull, but he was happy. He didn't know they were homeless. He only knew he was with her. The rain started again as they crossed the county line. The wipers smeared the water across the glass. Martha leaned forward, squinting at the dark road. She thought about the bedroom she had designed in the estate. She thought about the heated floors and the silk curtains. None of it belonged to her. The only thing she owned was sitting in the passenger seat and resting in her pocket. She kept driving. The truck gave one final, shuddering cough as Martha reached the edge of the village. The engine died exactly in front of a gas station with 2 rusted pumps and a faded sign. Martha sat in the sudden silence of the cab for a long minute. The rain was drumming against the roof like 1,000 tiny fingers. Buster whined low in his throat and nudged her hand with his wet nose. She looked out the window at the village of the Hollow. It was 3 buildings and a memory. There was a general store with a faded green awning that sagged under the weight of the water. Next to it was a small diner with checkered curtains that had turned a pale, dusty pink. Across the narrow road stood the church. Street Judes of the Hollow was a skeleton of grey stone and dark ivy. The steeple looked like a broken finger pointing at the bruised clouds. Behind it sat the cottage. It was a small square of stone with a roof that appeared to be more moss than shingle. Julian had called it a property. Martha saw it for what it was, an abandoned ruin. She climbed out of the truck and felt the mud pull at her sensible leather shoes. Her knees popped with a sharp, dry sound that made her wince. She grabbed her suitcase and signaled for Buster to follow. The dog jumped down with a heavy thud and limped toward the church porch. Martha followed him, her head bowed against the wind. She reached the heavy oak doors of the church and fumbled with the iron ring. It wouldn't budge. "The side door is the one that still works," a voice called out. Martha turned. A man was standing under the awning of the general store. He wore a heavy yellow raincoat and held a thermos. He walked toward her with a pronounced limp that made his left shoulder dip with every step. He was older than Martha, with skin like a crumpled map and eyes the color of a winter lake. He stopped at the edge of the road and looked at her. He didn't look at her suitcase or her rusted truck. He looked at her face. "You're late, Martha Vance," he said. Martha froze. She hadn't been to this village since she was 6 years old. She hadn't spoken her maiden name to anyone in this county for decades. She gripped the handle of her suitcase until the plastic bit into her palm. "How do you know who I am?" she asked. Her voice was barely a whisper against the rain. The man walked across the road. He didn't seem to mind the water soaking his trousers. "I'm Thomas, the vicar, or what's left of one," he said. He reached the porch and shook himself like a wet dog. "Your mother told me to watch for a woman with silver hair and a silver thimble. She said you'd come eventually when the world got too loud for you. That was 30 years ago." Martha reached into her pocket and touched the sapphire on the rim of the thimble. The coincidence felt like a physical weight pressing against her chest. She looked at the vicar. He wasn't smiling. He looked relieved. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key on a leather cord. It was identical to the one Martha had in her own purse. "We've been waiting for you," Thomas said. He stepped toward the side door of the church and turned the key. The lock groaned, but the wood gave way. "The cottage is a mess. The roof in the kitchen is mostly a suggestion, but the vestry is dry. I've been keeping a fire going in there since I saw your truck come over the ridge." Martha followed him inside. The air was cold, but it carried the scent of beeswax and old paper. She looked up at the stained glass windows. They were covered in decades of grime, but the light from the street lamp outside caught a shard of deep blue glass. It was the exact color of the sapphire on her thimble. Buster walked into the center of the nave and sat down. He didn't whine. He let out a long sigh and rested his head on his paws. "Julian said this place was worthless," Martha said. She looked at the peeling plaster on the walls. She looked at the holes in the floorboards. Thomas turned back to her at the door of the vestry. He held the heavy leather cord in his hand. "Julian Vance is a man who only sees what he can sell," the vicar said. "He never learned how to look at what's hidden. Your great-grandfather built this place for a reason, Martha. He didn't build it for the Vances. He built it for you." Martha walked to the small stone fireplace where a single log was glowing. She sat on a wooden bench and felt the heat reach her frozen fingers. She looked at her reflection in a dusty silver platter on the wall. She looked 66 years old. She looked tired. But for the first time in 40 years, she didn't feel like a guest in her own life. She was home. Martha's first morning in the vestry was a lesson in physics. The stone floor did not hold heat. The wool coat she had slept in was damp from the humidity. When she tried to stand, her left knee joint made a loud, dry click. A sharp throb started in her lower back and stayed there. She sat on the edge of the wooden bench for 5 minutes before she could walk. She had $7.42 in her purse. She spent the morning mapping the leaks in the cottage roof. There were 4 major holes in the kitchen and 2 in the bedroom. She found a stack of old plastic tarps in the church basement. They were covered in dust and spider webs. She dragged them across the yard one by one. Her hands were red and raw by noon. The skin on her knuckles had cracked from the cold water. She didn't have money for work gloves. She used a discarded length of garden hose to tie the tarps down. She found a heavy branch to weigh the edges. Every movement was slow and deliberate. By evening, her fingers were so swollen she couldn't close them into a fist. Thomas appeared at the gate at 4 o'clock. He carried a small wooden crate with 3 jars of preserved peaches and a loaf of bread. He didn't ask how she was doing. He looked at the tarps on the roof. "The wind comes from the north tonight," he said. "You'll want to move that branch to the other side." He stayed to help her shift the weight. He didn't say a word about Julian or the city. He talked about the soil in the hollow and how it held the frost. He left before dark. Martha went back to the vestry and lit a single candle. The despair came when the sun went down. The darkness in the church was absolute. She looked at her phone. The battery was at 12%. There were no missed calls. There were no messages from Sarah or David. The last text in her inbox was a reminder from the pharmacy in the city. It was about her blood pressure medication. She knew she couldn't afford to fill it. She thought, "I am 66 years old. I have $7.42. I cannot fix a roof and I cannot buy medicine." The math beyond that was too large to look at directly. The cold settled into her bones and refused to leave. She lay on the hard bench and pulled Buster close. "This is where I die," she thought. "Not tonight, but this is where it ends. This is what dying alone looks like." She closed her eyes and waited for sleep. Then, a small sound broke the silence. A bird had flown into the church through a broken pane. It was trapped near the ceiling. It beat its wings against the stone, over and over. It didn't stop. It didn't give up. Martha watched the small shadow move against the rafters. She felt the silver thimble in her pocket. She stood from her wet mattress and looked at the roof. "I'm not dying in this shed," she said. Her voice echoed in the empty nave. "I'm not dying because some man decided I wasn't worth keeping." She stood tall, ignoring the fire in her back. I'm 66 years old and I still matter." She grabbed a bucket and went back out into the rain. The bird found the window and flew into the night. Martha was on her knees scrubbing the stone floor of the vestry when the soap slipped from her hand. The sliver of lye slid across the damp stone and disappeared into a shadow beneath the heavy oak cabinet. Martha sighed and leaned forward, her shoulder joint grinding with a sharp, dry heat. She reached into the dark space. Her fingers didn't find the soap. They found a gap in the stone where the mortar had crumbled into fine grey sand. Buster walked over and sat beside her, his tail thumping once against the wood. He began to scratch at the base of the cabinet. His claws made a frantic, hollow sound. "I'm trying, Buster," Martha said. She pushed against the heavy oak cabinet. It didn't move. She used her shoulder, bracing her feet against the floor. The wood groaned and shifted 3 inches. Behind it, a single stone in the wall sat crooked. The edges were clean, as if they had never been mortared at all. Martha reached into her pocket and pulled out the silver thimble. She slid it onto her thumb to protect her skin. She hooked her thumb into the gap and pulled. The stone was heavy. It slid out of the wall with a sound like grinding teeth. Behind it sat a box made of dark, heavy lead. Martha's breath caught in her throat. It felt like a physical weight pressing against her lungs. She reached in and pulled the box onto the floor. It was cold. It was smaller than a shoebox, but twice as heavy. Her hands began to tremble so violently that she had to set the box down. She waited. She watched the dust motes dancing in a single beam of light from the high window. She reached out again. She used the edge of the silver thimble to scrape away a thick seal of black wax. The sapphire on the rim flickered in the light. The lid of the box opened with a soft, metallic click. Inside was a thick stack of papers wrapped in oilcloth. Martha pulled them out. The first document was a leather-bound ledger with the name Silas Vance embossed in gold. Her great-grandfather's handwriting was tight and precise. She turned the first page. The ink was faded, but readable. "The St. Jude's Perpetual Trust," she read aloud. The words felt strange in the empty room. She looked at the date on the first entry. June 14th, 1966. Exactly 60 years ago this month. She turned the pages slowly. Each one was a bank statement. Each one showed a deposit and an interest calculation. She read the first statement twice. She didn't understand the numbers at first. $10,000 had been placed in a high-yield account when the church was closed. She turned to the middle of the book. The numbers were growing. She saw the years passing in columns of black ink. 1980, 1995, 2010. Her hands were shaking so hard the paper rattled. She reached the final page. It was a statement from 3 months ago. It was addressed to the resident of the vestry, St. Jude's of the Hollow. Martha stared at the bottom line. She closed her eyes and took a ragged breath. She opened them and looked again. The balance was written in clear, bold figures. $2,847,312.44. She looked at the small print at the bottom. Trust to be dissolved, and funds released to the oldest living female descendant of Silas Vance upon the 60th anniversary of the church's closing, provided she is in residence. Martha looked around the cold, damp room. She looked at the bucket of grey water. She looked at her work-worn hands. "He knew," she whispered to the empty church. She looked at Buster. He knew Julian would try to take everything. She ran her fingers over the sapphire on her thimble. The stone was the same deep blue as the glass in the windows above her. She realized she wasn't looking at a ruin anymore. She was looking at the foundation of a kingdom. She sat on the floor with the papers against her chest. The weight of the paper felt heavier than the lead box. She didn't cry. She simply sat in the silence and listened to the rain. The math was no longer an impossible mountain. It was a map. That was when everything changed. Martha Vance did not buy a new truck or designer clothes with the first release from the trust. She bought 6 crates of reclaimed Vermont slate and 3 rolls of heavy copper flashing. She spent 2 weeks watching a crew of 3 men strip the rotting moss from the cottage roof. They replaced the soft timber with keyline dried cedar beams that smelled of the deep forest. The sound of hammers became the new heartbeat of the hollow. Martha spent her days on a scaffold inside the church nave. She had a bucket of distilled water and a pack of specialized soft sponges. She started with the great west window. It was a mosaic of deep blues and vibrant crimsons that had been hidden under layers of coal soot. She worked slowly, 1 square inch at a time. She used her silver thimble to test the stability of the lead came between the glass pieces. When the thimble tapped the metal, it made a clear, ringing sound that echoed in the rafters. By the third week, the grime began to give way. She found a signature etched into the corner of a sapphire pane. It was her mother's maiden name, dated 1955. Her mother had been the one to clean these windows when she was a girl. The physical work was exhausting. Martha's shoulders burned, and her hands were stained with grey dust. But the throb in her back felt different now. It was the ache of a builder, not the pain of a victim. The transformation moved from the roof down to the floors. She hired a local carpenter to sand the oak planks until the grain looked like ripples in a pond. They treated the wood with beeswax and linseed oil. The scent of the church changed from damp mold to sun-warmed honey. The cottage was next. The holes in the kitchen were sealed with stone, salvaged from the old mill down the road. She didn't want new materials where old ones would tell a better story. She bought a small, cast-iron stove that put out enough heat to make the stones glow. She painted the cottage walls a soft cream that caught the morning light. She repaired the garden gate and oiled the hinges until they moved without a sound. The garden itself was a tangle of briars and dead stalks. She spent her evenings pulling the thorns until her forearms were mapped with small red lines. Beneath the weeds, she found the original stone path. It led from the church door to the cottage porch. The path was made of river stones, worn smooth by 100 years of footsteps. The moment the property became truly beautiful happened on a Tuesday in late October. The sun hit the great west window at exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The light didn't just enter the room. It poured across the oak floor in long, vibrating bands of sapphire blue. The dust motes in the air looked like floating gold flakes. The blue light settled on Martha's silver hair and turned it to mercury. Buster lay in a patch of warmth on the floor and sighed. The church was no longer a skeleton. It was a jewel box. Martha stood in the center of the nave and looked at her hands. They were calloused and scarred from the stone and the lye. She closed her eyes and felt the warmth of the light on her face. She was 66 years old and she had built a sanctuary. The structure was solid. The roof was tight. The woman inside was finally home. Martha stopped charging her phone. The battery died on a Tuesday morning, and she left the black glass screen face down on the pine table. The silence that followed was not a void. It was a room she finally had permission to inhabit. She spent her mornings in the garden, moving through the waist-high grass with a pair of rusted shears. She wasn't looking for roses anymore. She was looking for the structure of the land her great-grandfather had loved. One evening, a truck pulled over by the stone wall. A man in a grease-stained cap climbed out and leaned against the fender. He didn't ask if she needed help. He didn't offer her a business card. "My grandfather was married in that nave," he said. He pointed a calloused finger toward the blue light of the great west window. He always said the light in there could cure a bad harvest. Martha didn't invite him in. She simply stood with her shears and nodded. "It still can," she said. By the following week, the word had moved through the hollow like a slow-moving stream. Others began to arrive. They didn't come to rescue a lonely woman. They came because the church was breathing again. An elderly woman named Mrs. Higgins brought a box of heirloom seeds. She didn't mention the divorce. She didn't ask about the city. She spent 3 hours on her knees beside Martha, digging into the cold earth. They worked in a silence that was a conversation between equals. They talked about the drainage of the north slope. They talked about the way the frost settled in the valley. Martha realized she was no longer the woman who sat in the second row of a boardroom. She was a woman who knew the exact texture of the soil under her fingernails. One night, when the moon was high and the church was filled with silver light, Martha sat in the front pew. She looked at the empty pulpit. She thought of Silas Vance, the man who had seen 60 years into the future. "You knew I'd need the stone to hold me up," she whispered to the shadows. "You knew I'd try to build on sand until I had no choice but to come home." She didn't wait for an answer. The house didn't need to speak. A physical sensation started in the center of her chest. It was a warmth that had nothing to do with the cast-iron stove. It was a steady, rhythmic pulsing that matched the slow creak of the rafters. Her breath slowed. Her shoulders dropped away from her ears. For the first time in 40 years, she didn't feel like she was waiting for a signature to tell her who she was. She was Martha. She was the keeper of the blue light. She was the woman who had survived the glass tower. The community didn't give her a title. They simply started calling the place Martha's Church. She didn't correct them. She just kept the lanterns lit. Julian arrived on a Thursday afternoon in a black SUV that looked like a bruise against the autumn gold of the trees. He stepped out of the car and immediately looked at his shoes. The fine Italian leather was covered in a thin layer of mountain dust. He didn't look at the restored Great West window. He didn't look at the garden where the heirloom lavender was beginning to take hold. He looked at the new slate on the roof and then at the ledger in Martha's hand. Julian walked toward the porch with his hands open, as if he were carrying a peace offering. "Martha, we've been so worried about you," Julian said. "The children and we've been talking. It's not safe for you out here alone. We're just being realistic." Martha didn't put down her garden trowel. She didn't stand up to greet him. She stayed on her knees in the dirt and kept working the soil around a rose bush. "This is what's best for everyone," Julian continued. "I've heard some rumors about a trust, a legal oversight from the Vance estate." He stopped at the edge of the stone path. He didn't step onto it. "We should probably have the company attorneys look into that for you," he said. His voice was smooth and practiced. "To make sure everything is handled correctly. You know how complicated these things get. We're not being cruel, we're being practical." Martha looked up then. The sun was behind her, catching the silver in her hair. Julian squinted against the light. He looked smaller than he had in the glass tower. He looked like a man who was used to air conditioning and filtered water. "You're not here because you're worried, Julian," Martha said. Her voice was quiet. It carried across the silent yard like a bell. "You're here because you did the math. You realized the property you threw away has more value than the company you kept." Julian's face tightened. The mask of concern slipped for a second. "You're sitting on family capital, Martha. Capital that belongs in the business. It's a clean break, remember? That's what the papers said." He took a step forward, his polished shoe landing in the mud. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. We can settle this quietly." Martha stood up slowly. Her back didn't ache. Her knees felt strong and grounded. She wiped her hands on her canvas apron. She felt the silver thimble in her pocket. It was a weight and a shield. "You gave me this church because you thought I was the help," she said. "You gave it to me because you thought it was a ruin. You were wrong about the building, and you were wrong about me." Julian opened his mouth to speak. He looked at the church doors. He saw Vicar Thomas standing in the shadows of the vestibule. He saw the local carpenter's truck parked by the gate. He realized he wasn't in a boardroom where he held the gavel. He was on Martha's land. "I'm keeping the trust, Julian," Martha said. She turned back to her roses. She didn't wait for him to respond. "And I'm keeping the name. Vance meant something in this valley long before you turned it into a logo. I'm going to make sure it means something again." Julian stood in the mud for a long minute. He looked at the black SUV. He looked at the woman who was no longer waiting for his permission to exist. He didn't say goodbye. He climbed back into his car and reversed down the narrow drive. The sound of the engine faded. The door clicked shut behind him. 1 year after the morning she arrived, the air in the hollow was crisp and smelled of wood smoke. Martha sat in the front pew of St. Jude's with a basket of sewing supplies at her feet. The afternoon sun was low. The great west window cast a pool of deep violet light across the polished oak floor. Buster lay in the center of the light, his white muzzle resting on his paws. Martha held a square of heavy green velvet. She was mending a small tear in the altar cloth. She reached into the basket and pulled out the silver thimble. She slid it onto her thumb. The sapphire on the rim caught a stray beam of light and glowed like a coal. She pushed the needle through the thick fabric. Her hands were steady. The skin on her knuckles was dark from a summer spent in the garden. She didn't look at the time. She didn't listen for the sound of a car in the drive. The village was quiet, but it was not empty. There were jars of honey on the kitchen counter from the neighbors' hives. There was a stack of books by the bed that Thomas had lent her. The cottage roof was tight and the stone was dry. The garden was dormant now, waiting for the spring thaw. Martha looked up at the sapphire panes high above her. She thought about the 40 years she had spent in the city. She thought about the glass tower and the ebony desk. Those things felt like a story she had read in a book a long time ago. They didn't feel like her life. She felt the weight of the thimble on her thumb. It was no longer a shield against a husband's greed. It was a tool for the life she had reclaimed. "We kept the light in, Silas," she said softly to the empty nave. The words didn't echo. They stayed in the room like a promise kept. She pulled the final stitch tight and knotted the thread. She clipped the silk with a small pair of shears. She placed the thimble back in its velvet-lined box. It sat on the windowsill where the sun could reach it. She stood up and walked toward the door. Her knees moved without pain. She didn't look back at the city. She didn't look back at the woman she used to be. She was still here. Martha Vance's journey from a 42nd floor office to a stone vestry in the mountains proves that the world's definition of value is often a lie. It proves that a woman who spent decades building someone else's empire already has the tools she needs to build her own. Justice isn't always found in a courtroom or a signed settlement. Sometimes it is found in the quiet click of an old lock and the sapphire light of a restored window. The people who think you are invisible are often the ones who are blind to the treasure you carry. Martha didn't need Julian's permission to be worthy. She only needed to return to the foundation that had been waiting for her all along. The Hollow is no longer a ghost town. It is a sanctuary for those who know that strength isn't measured in tall buildings, but in the stone that survives the storm. The silver thimble on her windowsill is a reminder of a simple truth. The hands that do the hard work are the only ones that deserve to hold the reward. If Martha's story moved you, if you've ever felt like a silent architect in your own life, only to be forgotten when the work was done, this is your reminder. Leave the word light in the comments if you believe that no one can truly take what you've built with your own hands. Because Martha's story proves something that is always true. The foundations we build with love and sacrifice are the only ones that never crumble. Share this with someone who needs to remember that their greatest chapter might be waiting behind a door they haven't opened yet. Because together, we prove that dreams don't age.